Welcome to the Behavioral Groups Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We usually interview interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply that to work and life. But this is one of our grooving sessions where Kurt and I get to explore in depth a key concept or idea that intrigues us. Kurt, what intrigues us today?
That we're not interesting people because this...
Of course we're not interesting people. It's about the concepts. Those
Concepts are interesting.
Yes.
I got it. No, so Tim, for this episode, we're going to talk about behavioral priming. And this is going to be a multi-part concept that we're going to be doing. So
multiple episodes.
We will just cover a very small portion of it today in this grooving session. But Tim, before we start...
What?
We have a special offer for our listeners.
We do?
We do. So today we will be giving away 3 pairs of Today I Am Smart priming socks.
We are?
We are. So these are fantastic socks. They have a picture of Einstein on them. They say, Today I am smart. I wear them when I need myself to be just that little bit smarter in, a big presentation or talking with other smart people like you.
Me too. Well, I wear them as well. I am guilty as charged. Not today.
Not today, since it is warm and we're doing this in Minnesota in the summertime. However, we are going to be giving away 3 pairs of these socks.
Okay.
And we're going to randomly select winners from people who post this episode out to their favorite social media account, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and tag Behavioral Grooves, but also do the hashtag #IWantSocks.
Okay, so let me get this straight. All listeners have to do to be entered into the drawing is to post a link to this episode on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Let us know that they did it by doing the hashtag Behavioral Grooves or connecting to Behavioral Grooves, right? And then including the hashtag #IWantSocks.
#IWantSocks.
Got it. I think that's pretty straightforward.
All right. And so we'll then pick 3 randomly winners from the people who do that, and they'll be sent out to wherever you are in the world because we have worldwide listeners.
Yes, we do. Okay, so there is a lot to cover on priming, but we're just going to start with let's start with a definition.
Right.
And then some basic work that was done maybe in the 90s. How about that?
Right. So priming, the concept has been around for a long time. Basically, priming is a technique whereby exposure to one stimulus influences a response to a subsequent stimulus without conscious guidance or intention. So in other words...
So it could be unconscious.
It's subconscious. So
okay.
I will use that as opposed to unconscious. It's below the conscious level, but could be thought of. It could come up to the conscious level.
Okay.
With that, let's use an example. So in this case... research has shown multiple times that if I prime you with the term doctor, you are much more likely to see nurse as in a word search than you would bread. And they've done it where different things around the speed. So if I prime you with doctor, nurse is seen much faster than if I had primed you with bread in different pieces. So again, things that are associative, and there's different components of this. There's semantic, there's perceptual, there's associative, various different types of priming. And so those are all really interesting components that are very well documented, decades and decades of research on this.
Right.
The interesting part, and the part that has interested me, is this concept of behavioral priming. And it starts going back 20 years or so to John Bargh, who did some work on what he called social priming. And social priming is the concept of applying priming into states of kind of social components. So aspects in regards to potentially stereotypes, potentially into self-esteem components about how you are viewing yourself. And one of his very famous studies was the one where he basically had people do a word search that had, and forgive me if I'm not sure if it's a word search or a sentence completion component. I can't remember off the top of my head. I've looked at so many of these, where they were primed for words that were about old people. So it was elderly, Florida, various different P's.
Retirement, yeah.
Yes, those types of things. So people were primed, and they basically, it was this idea of spatial components that they thought they were doing. The real research actually happened when they had to turn their paper in, and they had to turn it in down the hall. And what the real research had was that somebody timed them as they walked down the hall. And so those people who were primed with these old age type words actually walked slower than the control group who did not have those primed words.
Yeah.
So,
So this is fascinating stuff, that just the words influence our behavior, how fast we walk, right?
it was groundbreaking. It was groundbreaking to the point where this research has been cited over 4,000 times in the literature. It launched a whole branch. People started looking at all sorts of different components around this. And again, all of these research studies were looking at different pieces of, can you prime on, there was priming around, words around professors and different things, and how well people actually then did on a Trivial Pursuit game versus a control group. And again, if you were primed with professor words, you were more likely to be answer more questions right in various different pieces.
Well, and Barg and Chartrand's work actually took it into classrooms where they primed students with, you're a very good student, or you're very bright. And those students did better. They actually performed better in their classwork than the students who were not primed with those words.
And there's different components on that, right? So there's a self-fulfilling prophecy component around there, where you tell yourself that I am smart, I am good, and even if you don't believe it, this is different than priming specifically, but it relates to it. And again, it shows that you can have that self-fulfilling prophecy. There's also the component I think that you were bringing up, which is called the Pygmalion effect.
Yes.
Where the research again on that was, these researchers went into the classroom. They told the teachers that, oh, Johnny and Melissa and Philip and Osam all scored super high on this test, which in fact was never done. It was a lie.
Right.
But they then looked over the course of the year and said, at the end of the year, those people who were identified as being smarter, even though they were no different than the rest of the class, actually performed better on standardized performance tests. So they actually improved their IQs, they improved a number of other components. The very fact of just telling the teacher that these were high potential students did that. That has been also repeated within organizations, where people have gone in and said, these are high potential candidates.
And they get treated differently?
And they get treated differently, and they get responded to differently. A little bit different than the priming that we are talking about here. But with that, I mentioned that the Barg's research had been kind of started this whole thing in a variety of different things. The elephant in the room, however, is probably around 2012, there started to be this replicability, I can never pronounce that word, I don't know why, crisis that has come to a lot of the social sciences.
Yes.
And one of the studies...
Barg's work in particular has been subject to the replication crisis.
Yes. And so the replication crisis is basically the fact that there are a number of studies, famous ones like Barg's as well as others, that when other researchers go in and try to replicate the findings, they can't.
So, for instance, the situation, the study where the people in the study are primed with all these words about old age and retirement and that sort of thing, and then what they're actually being measured on is how fast they walk from the room where they got primed to the place where they're going to drop off their
Right,
their
and so
results, right?
in the replication studies, there was no difference
Yeah.
in the speed between the control group and the speed of
primed
the
group.
primed group,
Yeah.
which doesn't bode well for the validity of the original. Now, that being said, there's lots of different things. One of the interesting pieces, there was some really interesting replication studies done on Barg's work, and this was it got a lot of press, various different things. It was done where it was the plus one, PLOS one, and what they did is they actually did two different studies. One where they replicated Barg's work on that as well as they could, but instead of Barg had a person who was using a stopwatch in the hallway, they used laser optical
readers, yeah.
readers, and so basically did that. When they used the optical readers, there was no difference. However, they did another study, and that study had the person in the replicated Bargs just like Barg did, with one difference, is they told the person who was in the hallway with the stopwatch what the intent of the study was. In that case, they found that there was an actual difference. And so they raised this concern. The priming effect is real, just who is it real on?
It was actually impacting, the priming was actually impacting the person who was conducting the study.
The prime was then on the person recording it.
Yeah.
Interesting studies both ways, very, very impactful. But I think the bigger piece here is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
And so the replication process, there's a lot of this work has been led by a gentleman by the name of Brian Nosek, who heads up the Open Science Collaboration. Done a lot of this work, and it's really interesting. I encourage people to go out and Google him and Google some of the podcasts that he's done, because he's very articulate. He talks about this, and he talks about, some of the reasons why this happens, right? And some of the reasons that these can't be replicated happen because of factors around the design of the study, and it maybe just wasn't a well-designed study. Maybe they're measuring something in the study that the design doesn't really intend to capture, and so you get a false positive, right? Or there's a low sample size. And with low sample size, it could just be because it's random. And you can't necessarily extrapolate it out to the larger audience. For whatever reason, this small sample size had some unique components around it, and you can't translate that to the larger general population. One of the interesting pieces, though, is this concept called p-hacking. That's p-hacking.
Yeah. Thank you. Good to clarify for the
so
listeners.
in psychology,
what's the focus of this?
So in psychology, and in many of any kind of social science research, as well as actually pretty much any other research, P is a measure of statistical significance. And in psychology, what you're trying to get is get your P level down to P factor down to a less than 0.05, which basically is saying you have less than a 5% chance that this was by random. Right? And so that the statistical way of looking at that is saying, 95% chance that this effect is real.
Yeah, that what we're revealing actually is causal in the
and that it is not just by random. So you still have a 5% chance, right? But that's usually the way that they look at this. P-hacking is this way of not intentionally often, right? But it is a way of dissecting and cutting the data and bringing different pieces in where you're just trying to find some factor in order for it to be significant. And so there's this other component that's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, right?
Right. I'm glad you're going to bring this up.
So
this is a great example.
Yeah, and so it's this idea: if you took a shotgun and you shot a shotgun from however far away at the side of a barn, right? and then you went over
There's a splatter pattern.
a splatter pattern that, if you look at the entire pattern, is random. But within that, there's certain clusters, right? You're going to get some of the buckshot that kind of tightly forms around this period or this area over here.
Yeah.
And if you, the Texas sharpshooter, the idea was, oh, look at this. And they draw a circle around where the tightest component of that is kind of their target. See how good I was.
This is
at
my
shooting.
target.
Yeah. And really what that does is it doesn't take into account the rest of the splatter, and it says these are the only things to look at. And that's kind of what happens in some of this p-hacking component. And if you remember back in the 70s and 80s, there was this whole component about cancer being looked at by electrical high wire lines that run through, and they said, oh yes, it causes this one kind of cancer. And that was done by a Scandinavian research that was doing that. And they basically did this component of this Texas sharpshooter fallacy, because they looked at, I think it was 852 different types of cancers with all this data of people living within 300 meters of different things. And just by the sheer number of these, they didn't say, oh, colon cancer we think is caused by this. They just looked to see if there's any correlation. And just by the sheer fact that there's 852, you're more likely going to find correlation. Yes. And so that being that, so that could be one of these factors. And that happens a lot because in order to get published, researchers need to have statistically significant components. And so they're looking to get these things published. And so there's a publishing component. There's also this publishing component where what people look at and research and understand is only the research that gets published, and not all the experiments that don't meet that 0.5 or just don't have any really interesting things. And so again, biases people around some of this stuff. So that's part of some of this.
So let's bring it back to the application side, specifically in the business world. Mm-hmm. How are primes being used, or where could primes be used? Where could they be used in a way to more effectively manage our day-to-day business life?
So I think that's a huge topic
that we will not answer right now.
That I think needs to have its whole component. Needless to say, we've talked a little bit about some of the studies before. The one that was done by Latham in regards to looking at call center productivity and using pictures of people working diligently in a call center on an information sheet versus a woman running through a finish line versus no component. And there is significant difference in how those call center people performed based on just the difference between what picture was shown, which should have no impact in any type of performance in a rational way. Yeah. And so again, that gives some of those priming pieces. I think the thing around this that is important is to understand that while there is all this replicability crisis and kind of concern over some of these studies, there are a number of good studies out there that show that this effect is real.
Yeah.
And there has been meta-analysis, and we'll talk about that probably in the next one too. Meta-analysis is where you look at multitude of studies and you look and commonize some of the components and look to find some of those key things. And there has been meta-analysis that shows that these priming effects are real. But I think it's important to look at this and to try to understand the research, and to not just take any individual study and extrapolate that out to the general world.
The body of work is huge.
You have to look at the body of literature that's out there, and look at things like sample size. Look at research design. Are they actually studying something, and are they measuring the thing that the study design is doing? How big are the effects? That's another thing that often gets missed, right? Is sometimes these effects might be significant. In other words, they pass this component of the 95%, the p factor of being less than 5, but they're super small.
Yeah.
Right. So
Whereas, for instance, with Gary Latham's work on the call center employees, they had the effect was huge.
the impact was huge.
Yeah,
right?
it wasn't a
It
modest
wasn't
difference.
a modest
Yeah.
impact. The other thing is, in looking at some of these replication components, you have to look at there's a changing world, right? And so maybe the dynamics that impacted this before, the way people viewed elderly people, that might have shifted, and so we no longer think of elderly people as being slow, and so it doesn't prime that for us. I don't know that. That's just a thing. And then there's just unintended changes in some of these replication components. The replication study might have been flawed, right? That might have been the one that flawed. Or there could be confounding effects, right? There could be these things. Maybe the room was painted red, and red actually primes a different component, and so you then have confounding factors that counter impact each other, or various different things. Or it was cold and instead of hot, or it was at the end of the day versus the beginning of the day. There are a variety of number confounding factors. Now again, that happens if there's a small effect and all these other things, but they could impact the replication of these. So
They could certainly be compounded.
Yes.
And realistically speaking, we are being primed constantly,
we are.
all the time.
If you think about advertising to a certain degree is all about priming. It is setting a course of action for you, so that when you go into a store, you pick Kellogg's Raisin Bran over Post Raisin Bran because
Absolutely.
of the way that you have been primed around that. So with that, I think we have covered a lot. And I think we have a lot more to cover.
Right. We need to talk more about business applications.
Yep.
We need to talk more about the meta-analysis. And I think that there are some really good studies that we can get into in future episodes as well, specifically on priming.
Yes. And we can talk about our own little sock experiment.
Which, #I want socks.
If you want the Einstein Today I Am Smart socks, make sure you send out this to your social media and do the #I want socks, and make sure Behavioral Grooves is there so that we know we can find it, and you'll be entered into the drawing.
So thanks for listening.